welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. My name is Arun Seraphin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute here at the National Defense Industrial Association. I'm sitting in as guest host here for my boss, Dr. Mark Lewis, who's the Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute. And it's my pleasure today to have as my guest Mr. Joe Bryan, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer and Senior Advisor for Climate to the Secretary of Defense. Prior to his appointment, Joe was a consultant focused on clean energy technology and its intersection with national security. He's previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, where he was responsible for policies related to the department's installation and operational energy programs. Before that, Joe and I knew each other in the Senate, where he led investigations for the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was on the professional staff of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as the Permanent Select Subcommittee on Investigations, which is a part of the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee. And prior to that, we shared a boss, and you worked for Senator Carl Levin from Michigan in his personal office. It's a nice long resume. Thanks for joining me today, Joe.
Sure.
So
good to see you again.
Today we're going to try to talk about the department's priorities in energy and climate and sustainability, and you're the perfect person to lead us through this conversation. So first, just tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to this current role.
Great. Well, you read half my origin story on the bio, so we'll start with the interesting bits, and then we can always get to that. I grew up in Cleveland, the great North Coast and the rock and roll capital of the world, and I think that's probably an important data point. Came east for school, graduate school, and then spent a lot of time working energy policy in the Northeast. Around the time in the early 90s when we were going through a lot of utility restructuring. Then I went overseas for a couple of years and worked on energy policy in Southern Africa before coming back to the States and moving to Washington, D.C. I worked in the House of Representatives for a while with Congressman John Lewis. Then came over and joined the Senate staff of Senator Carl Levin, who we both worked with, is just a fabulous person, a fabulous senator, and a great boss. I spent about 14 years with Carl and in the capacities that you mentioned in the opening here, and then I went over at the end of the last 2 years of the Obama administration as the DAS for Energy at Navy, and worked with Secretary Mabus. And energy, if folks recall from that time, energy and climate were actually a high priority for Secretary Mabus, and I think in a lot of ways he was ahead of his time on thinking through some of these things. And I left in the intervening years at the end of the Obama administration and then came back under President Biden to do the climate and some of the energy work for the Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, so after that career path, now you're the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Department of Defense. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so interestingly, I joined the administration a year and a half ago, roughly, and I was made the chief or the senior climate advisor to the Secretary and the Deputy, and then. Actually, earlier this year in 2022, I took the title of I was assigned the title of Chief Sustainability Officer. And Chief Sustainability Officer is actually a position that's been in the department for some time, going back to the Obama administration. It previously existed within acquisition and sustainment, and it was normally the assistant secretary over there. But this administration, understanding the priority that climate and advanced energy have for this administration, and also understanding the cross-cutting nature of sustainability climate issues, and that they're not something that you can just assign to ANS or any one component of the department. What the Secretary decided to do was to pull that position out of the bureaucracy and put it in the front office. This is pretty consistent with a lot of what you see in the private sector, putting the Chief Sustainability Officer in the C-suite, having them report to the CEO of a company, and then responsible for sort of strategic initiatives across organizations. And that's what we've tried to mirror or replicate in our office. It is not our job as the climate officer or as the Chief Sustainability Office to run the whole department. Our job is to identify priorities, the strategic direction of the department when it comes to climate and sustainability, clean energy, and then to work with the components and the services to make sure we're delivering and holding ourselves accountable to the objectives and goals that we've set for ourselves. So we have a small office within the Secretary's office, a handful of people, and we work across the department with all the components and the services to advance the Secretary's and administration's agenda around climate and energy.
So sustainability, climate, clean energy, Those aren't terms we usually associate with warfighting, with power projection, with deterrence, with operational readiness. How do I connect those two?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that is really the focus of what we do in our everyday work. So what we know is that the department's core mission is to defend the United States, to deter aggression, and to prepare ourselves, the force, to fight and win wars should that become necessary. And our climate agenda and our energy agenda are exceptionally well aligned with that core objective, core mission. And let me explain to you why. Look, what we know is that climate change is causing tremendous dislocation and challenges around the world. And what that does is create significant new mission for the Department of Defense. So climate from displacing people who are ending up from Central America, migrating north and ending up the U.S. southern border, to places like the Sahel, to Syria. What we know is that climate change is causing significant issues for local governments and is creating challenges for stability around the world. Now,
so that's kind of regional instability in the same way that religious extremism,
that's right,
or information operations through use of social media, things like that, are going to create these hotspots where our forces might be necessary.
That's right. That's right. And what we know is that it's creating a demand signal for us, whether that's humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, defense support to civil authorities, or, as you say, instability that's climate is a contributor to, which then ends up in our job jar, right, and things that the Department of Defense is asked to do. So it's creating demand for new missions. And the interesting thing about climate change is it's also at the same time challenging our ability to respond to that demand. So climate impacts readiness, right? It certainly impacts resources if you look across from Tyndall to Pensacola to Offutt Air Force Base to the West Coast and what we see now with wildfires and water. The challenges to the department in terms of keeping ourselves ready to do our job are exceptional and cross-cutting. So
are there good examples of missions being affected by these kinds of climate events?
Sure. The National Guard mission is an easy one, right? We spend the National Guard commander has said that we used to have what's called a fire season, and now we have a fire year. Guard missions for wildfires have increased something like tenfold over the past decade. So we're seeing significant demands on the force from things like wildfire fighting, or and also from things like responding to hurricanes. We just saw that.
So
recently.
that op tempo then affects personnel, affects equipment, affects
all those
budgets,
things,
right?
Yeah, all those things. And I mean, the cost, if you think about cost from something like Tyndall, $5 billion cost for Hurricane Michael and Tyndall. At Camp Lejeune was something like $3 billion. So creating demand for forces and at the same time impacting our ability to respond to demand. And the interesting thing about our climate and energy work is that our solutions to some of those challenges, with respect to climate, are also aligned with our mission readiness, right? So if you think about our logistics challenges in the Pacific, for example, what we know is that we are not going to have a free pass to deliver what we need when we need it to the places we need it in the Pacific. Our logistics are going to be contested should we find ourselves in a contingency. Now, one of the best ways you can mitigate the risk of contested logistics is to not require logistics in the first place. So anything we can do to make the force more efficient, to make our ships, our airplanes, our tactical vehicles more efficient, to deploy distributed generation and energy storage, to alleviate the demand for liquid fuel, anything we can do there not only mitigates the logistics risk, but also happens to be good for the climate, setting aside the fact that it brings with it some significant combat capabilities. So the alignment of our mission objectives and our climate and energy related agenda are exceptional, and that's what we work towards every day.
And I don't want to lose the combat capability piece, especially because we're the Emerging Technologies Institute.
Right.
But I mean, the way we think about this, we think about energy efficiency, reducing the load on the dismounted soldier or Marine, less batteries to carry, less whatever's to carry, increasing the range of ground vehicles, increasing the range of ships, increasing the range of planes, increasing potentially the speed on missiles and things like that. And so time on target for drones,
Yeah.
right? So those are all combat impacts or things that happen to be resulting from energy efficiency, which you might also say has a positive impact on the climate.
Yeah, no question. I mean, an easy one is hybridization or electrification of ground tactical vehicles. Look, we know that massive advancements very fast advancements on battery technology in the commercial sector offer potentially significant capabilities for the Department of Defense and our military. Things like an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle can be on silent watch for much longer. An electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle can have a shorter, require less of the logistics system. It can be, it can actually extend range. It can have lower heat signature. So all kinds of, you need battery technology to support, platform-based directed energy weapons and new capabilities that we want to integrate into our platforms. So in that case, something that's happening, development that's happening very quickly because our transportation system is going electric very quickly, that rebounds to us as a significant combat capability. And as you say, it also happens to be good for the climate, but we pursue these things because they provide us capability, not simply because they're good for the climate.
It seems like this technology area you're working in also ties into with another major DoD initiative that we care about at ETI, which is working more closely with the commercial sector. It seems like there's a lot of innovation coming from the commercial sector in all of these energy efficiency spaces. So how do you tap into that and bring those technologies into the defense space?
Yeah, that's a great point and a really good question. So the truth of the matter is there's something on the order of $1 trillion in private money invested in, we'll stick with the battery supply chain, right? There's about $1 trillion up and down the supply chain, from extraction to processing to battery production. That $1 trillion is advancing that technology exceptionally rapidly. We just can't match that in the Department of Defense, nor should we try. I mean, we have specialty battery needs that we might, for example, want to really hone in on. But for most of our platforms, and we have thousands and thousands of military platforms that rely on battery technology, we can be a fast follower to the commercial industry who's investing a tremendous amount of money, as we said, in that technology. And in that respect, we are looking and we need to look outside the 4 or 5 walls of the Pentagon into the commercial space to see what's happening. And I think that's also true across the energy industry. I mean, a lot of innovation is happening in advanced solar, advanced renewables, battery technologies, control systems. All of that technology is coming out of the private sector, and I think that's where we need to look. Now, how do we do that is a really good question. One of the things we've recognized in the department is the need to, for all the reasons I described earlier, to really get after energy efficiency and distributed generation support for our deployed force, particularly in the Pacific, so that we can reduce logistics demand and mitigate some of the risks that we know come along with that. So in April of this year, the Deputy Secretary put out a directive that energy demand reduction should be a part of every acquisition program, whether it's a new system or whether it's upgrades to existing systems. And following that, Acquisition and Sustainment put out some guidance to the services, and we're all working through this big problem. What we know is that we know some things inside the department, but the development of technologies and capabilities frequently comes from the private sector and from your members and members of the defense community. And so what we need is, we are sending out a demand signal, and what we also need is a supply signal, right? We need people to come and talk to us and tell us, what should we be looking at? What does the commercial sector see both today and what's coming? And where should we be placing our bets? Because we think this whole sector of energy is transforming so quickly. We're in a global industrial revolution when it comes to energy. And that change is happening in the private sector, and we need to make sure we're facing that way. We're hearing from your members.
So you're in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, work for the Secretary, you talked about the Deputy Secretary pushing out guidance. Most of the money in the department is spent by the services. The requirements are written by the services. So how are you influencing the activities of services in the near and the long term to sort of be consistent with what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so the guidance that the Deputy put out in April led to a review by ANS of service programs and service activities to support demand reduction, energy efficiency in the force and on platforms. So we are going through a process now of determining, okay, there's been, for example, we don't want to get too in the weeds here, but there's been an energy key performance parameter in place for systems for a decade. How are we doing on that? I think the truth is we could be doing a lot better. Mm-hmm. And so but services, as you point out, that own those programs. So elevating this discussion to the Secretary's level, making sure the services all understand the objectives here, and then doing real, no-kidding reviews of service programs to see how they line up. And I think what we're seeing across the services now is some leadership and some understanding of the challenges we face are joint and cut across the services when you think to the Pacific and our logistics challenges, and that we all need to be part of that solution. So I think there's progress, but we have to work with the services every day on this, because you're right. It's they who own the requirements and who buy the system.
So how are we talking about NDI members and commercial sector providing the technologies and the innovation that could be incorporated into achieving these kinds of goals? Where should members be looking for these kinds of opportunities? Who should they be talking to? Not everyone can find their way into the Chief Sustainability Officer's office. So where are the right points of contact?
So program offices. This demand signal, while this is relatively new and due time, it's very new, and that this guidance came out from the deputy in April. Acquisition Sustainment conducted their review, and they're in the middle of reviewing service programs. The program offices should be feeling a demand signal for what can we do to improve the energy performance of our systems that we are responsible for.
Whether that potentially is a differentiator on who wins awards or things like that.
That exactly. And even for existing systems, where are the improvements? Look, most of what we have in the force is existing, right? We have what we have now. We're buying new things, but we're going to have what we have for a while. And just because things exist doesn't mean they can't perform better. And in fact, they have to perform better to enable new capabilities and also mitigate some of these risks we're talking about. So even talking to program offices about your existing system and saying, hey, if we did things a little bit differently, or if we operated this system a little bit differently, if we incorporated this technology at this point in the system, we may be able to make some improvements against what we know is an overarching strategic objective here. And it's important, frequently we look at programs as one-offs, but any demand you create for fuel or logistics on a single platform, that aggregates up to the entire department. And so when you create a demand on the joint force, it's not just you who are creating the demand, it's all kinds of other systems that are doing the same things, and those things add up. So I think individual conversations both about what's coming down the line in terms of future systems, but also how can we make improvements to existing systems? And we should have an open door to those kinds of conversations.
So we're recording this during election season here in Washington. To my knowledge, the previous administration did not have a senior advisor for climate to the secretary, but this administration does. The word climate implies that this is not the most bipartisan issue. What's been your experience on whether or not this has been embraced as something that the department should go after on a bipartisan basis, or if not, what inroads are you making to try to make it more of a bipartisan issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we all recognize what's going on outside of our four walls, right? There's just change happening, and I think we need to understand that, and we need to be able to operate as a force in the context of that change. The truth is that climate change not only impacts the Department of Defense in the United States, it affects our allies and partners, and it affects our adversaries and competitors. And the alliances, the countries, the militaries that are best equipped to respond to changes in the environment around us and are most resilient to those changes are going to have a competitive advantage. And so I think we, as a department, would be making a mistake not to pay attention to what's happening around us. I'll say this, I think you probably speak to this too, Arun, from your time in the Hills, that these ideas of operational energy efficiency, of reducing sustainment costs, reducing logistics requirements, those are very bipartisan ideas. Operational energy has been around, operational energy initiatives have been around for a long time, and there's been pretty strong bipartisan support for it, mostly because it just makes sense from a warfighting perspective. I think similarly, when you look at what we're doing on our installations, the truth is we face a threat environment, sure, from climate, but also from things like cyber attacks or even kinetic attacks that could make the commercial electric grid or commercial gas supplies vulnerable. And we as a department and our installations rely on those commercial grids and pipelines for our performance. Now, the best way to mitigate some of those risks is to A, become super efficient so you don't demand as much of the grid. Two, to put distributed generation and storage inside the fence line to keep critical missions up and running should a weather event or a cyber attack or a kinetic attack make the commercial grid unavailable. And so those things that you do that I just described, distributed generation, energy efficiency, are not only good for the climate, but those are what you do because it's just good business. And I'll give you the example recently of, we have a microgrid system at Miramar, Marine Corps Air Base Miramar outside San Diego. And during the heat wave in California, what is it? We're in a couple months ago. Miramar was able to take their load offline 10 times to both help preserve the mission and also to help preserve the commercial electric grid for everybody. And their contribution helped avoid rolling blackouts in that part of Southern California. So I think the answer is that what we're doing, we started this conversation by talking about what the department's core mission is, and we've had this conversation around how what we're doing with respect to climate and energy aligns with that mission. It may be good for the climate, but you should be doing it anyway because that's just a smart thing to do.
All right, we're going to close with one last question. The driver for what the department's doing, national defense strategy, national security strategy, is competition with China. How does your office fit into the overall construct of the competition with China?
Right. So national security strategy makes it pretty clear. National defense strategy makes it clear. Like we are in a decisive decade when it comes to national security in this country and globally. And two things actually that my office is focuses on quite a bit is one, competition with China for the technologies that are going to define the future, and that includes military relevant technologies, and especially in the energy space. When you look at supply chains for clean energy, make no mistake about it, there is a massive global transformation happening around energy. It's defining markets, it's defining capability, and we need to be part of that competition, both for economic reasons and also for military reasons, because look, our capabilities, we can derive a significant amount of capability from those technologies. So we are very aware of the competition we have with China and very attuned to how do we bring those capabilities to the United States, reshoring as much as possible, or at least nearshoring it with allies and partners to make sure that we have the supply chains necessary to capture the capability benefits of that technology. And then on climate, look, it's a decisive decade when it comes to climate. And as I said a couple minutes ago, things are changing. And that change isn't just happening for the United States, it's happening for everyone. And so we have to figure out whether in the competition with China, do we want to be the most resilient to the change that's inevitably happening? Just look around us. And if we can do that, if we can lead, if we can build the alliances and partnerships necessary, then we'll be the more resilient force. We'll be the more resilient country to the inevitable changes that we see happening around us. So,
with that, I want to thank our guest, Joe Bryan, for joining us today, and thanks everyone for watching another episode of Emerging Tech Horizons.
Great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.